Good afternoon and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Marielle Villeray, Program Development Director for the Office of Academic Initiatives and Strategic Innovation at the Graduate Center, the new home for LP Squared, the Lifelong Peer Learning Program, formerly known as IRP. Fridays at 3 is a series of lectures organized by members of the LP Squared and open to all. This is one of many initiatives within LP Squared and within our office at the Graduate Center, through which we aim to expand minds and connection between students, faculty, and the public realm. We are taking questions and answers today for the latter part of our program, and you can submit your questions using the tool on the lower register of your Zoom window. It looks like two overlapping conversation bubbles. Dr. Jamieson will be taking questions at the end of her talk. I'd like to welcome Ken Whitty of the Fridays at 3 committee to introduce our esteemed speaker, Kathleen Hall Jamieson.
Thank you, Marielle. I'm Ken Whitty. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest this afternoon. She's Kathleen Hall Jamieson. She's the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communication. Her research areas include political communication, studies of various forms of campaign communications, and the discourse of the presidency. She's the author or co-author of 16 books on the media, science communication, politics, and presidential campaigns. Her most recent book is Cyberwar: How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President. It won the 2019 R.R. Hawkins Award from the Association of American Publishers, and an expanded and revised paperback edition was published this year. PBS NewsHour anchor Judy Woodruff wrote of the book, "Kathleen Hall Jamieson has performed a great service not just for politicians, journalists, and curious citizens, but most important for American democracy, by taking a scholar's approach to answering one of the most urgent and gnawing questions of our time: how did Russia try to influence the US elections of 2016, and how much difference did that make?" This year, Professor Jamieson was elected to membership of the National Academy of Sciences and was awarded the 2020 NAS Public Welfare Medal for her, quote, nonpartisan crusade to ensure the integrity of facts in public discourse. Professor Jamieson co-founded factcheck.org as a way to help voters evaluate political claims. Welcome, Professor Jamieson.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Let me start by defining some terms. Many in the journalistic community, the scholarly community, and some politicians in particular have conventionalized the concept fake news. I'm trying to abolish those words from the vocabulary of those of us who study deception in politics, because I'm concerned that when you say fake news, what you're really saying is that there's some kinds of journalism that aren't trustworthy because they engage in fabrication. And by my definition of journalism and news self-correct. If there's a mistake and it's pointed out to them, they correct it. And as a result, they can't be fake news and still, by my definition, be news or journalism. So for me, that's an oxymoron. And I'd like to replace that concept with the notion of viral deception, VD. And I mean by that, draw all of your associations in from venereal disease. You don't want to catch it, you don't want to spread it, and if you see it, you want to quarantine it and try to cure it. And the reason for making that distinction is when I'm talking about what it is that the Russian trolls, that is, those individuals in St. Petersburg who entered the social media sphere pretending they were US nationals and tried to create opportunities for themselves to create influence there. I want to be able to talk about the virality of the content and talk about whether or not it was literally deceptive or not. So when something begins to spread in cyberspace and it's outside the normal gatekeeping functions that journalism employs in order to interdict those kinds of misleading statements, that kind of virality is what's problematic, as also is the deception. And I'd like to cast it that way. We're concerned about the virality and about the deception. We're not concerned about news. I'd also want to make a distinction between the troll activity that pretends it is news, and I don't want to call that fake news either. We know that the Russian trolls set up community news sites that got reasonable traction in some cases and drew in all the material they could find on social media from that local news environment, all of this from St. Petersburg. And we're doing it in order to create what I will call imposter news, by which I mean they were trying to create the sense that they were legitimate US news. Sometimes they appropriated the logos, sometimes they appropriated the names and just changed the rest of the identifier. So abc.com.com was not ABC News, but it sure looked like it. And when the local sites were appropriating the identity of community news, they were actually setting up a structure that's really relevant to us in these final days of the election. Because I argue this in the second edition of Cyberwar, they were lurking there, pretending they were local journalists, waiting until they got close to the election so that they could start trafficking misinformation about a rigged vote, about fraudulent voting, about problems with voting machines, and to magnify any actual instances in which problems had occurred. And so I want to cast that as imposter news, and I want to flag it as a warning to all of us who are still inside communities to be vigilant about those things where we can't really identify an owner or a reporter we can get on the phone, a person we can actually identify who's in our community, because we may in the closing days still be susceptible to that kind of lurking troll persona, which I'd like to cast as imposter news. So my first definition is around trying to get rid of the concept fake news, put in place viral deception for organic content that's problematic and deceptive. And the first part of that for deception, when we say, how do you know it's problematic and deceptive? They're pretending to be us. So the fact of their inauthenticity, or in the jargon of the platforms, their inauthentic accounts, is in fact a deception. They're engaging in viral deception, VD. I want to distinguish from a kind of viral deception in which they pretend they are news. And in that capacity, try to hijack the credibility that local news in particular carries in communities in order potentially to create an environment in which we delegitimize an electoral process that may actually be working fairly well. The second thing I'd like to do before talking through 2016 and its implications for now is to say that there has to be a theory about how communication works in order to make sense of what is a retrospective analysis of what the Russians did in 2016. We didn't actually know that the trolls were there engaging in viral deception and engaging in hijacking legitimate news identifications to pretend with imposter news that they were journalists. We didn't know that till the election was well over. So we couldn't really be gathering any social science data in real time. We did know the hacking had occurred and the hacking was affecting the media agenda. And we did pick up some data as a result about the effects, even as we were not completely clear about all of the ways in which that had moved through our various media channels to get into mainstream channels as well. So I want to talk about my theory about how that could have created an electoral effect, in part because it helps us understand how any kind of malign force within the United States or from outside can potentially create communication effects that might affect votes. My first premise is that when you create an imbalance in the messaging, when you've got more messaging against one side than against the other side, or more messaging for one side than for the other side, and when it is apparently credible, those imbalances can affect voters. They can affect voters in two ways. They can affect how you vote if you're undecided. They can also affect whether you vote or you don't vote. So those imbalances in messages can create communication effects. And we know that from our study of other environments, including health environments, but also studying political campaigns. That's actually the theory about how advertising creates influence. When both sides advertise at comparable levels, and you don't have a whole lot of disparity in the relative amount of access that each candidate has in other places, such as news, the ads tend to just blunt the effect on each side. There's comparable messaging. You don't tend to see much movement. But when you see imbalances in messaging, that's where we find ad effects. So my first premise is, if the Russian interventions, either inside your account in cyberspace or inside our news environment, and that is the news we as individuals would be watching, created imbalances that disadvantage Hillary Clinton, you could create a communication effect. My second theory, again drawn from the scholarly literature, is that most people don't vote aware that they're not considering all of the things that are actually potentially at play in electorate. Most of us think that we're actually considering everything that really matters, and we're unaware of the extent to which the media can increase the likelihood that some things are inside our vision, our sense of what is there, and some things are less so. That media agenda setting effect, increasing the likelihood that we think about a topic, is well documented for more than 40 years in the academic literature. And we know from experimental work that the considerations that are at play in your personal agenda, affected by media exposure, can affect the considerations you use when you decide how to vote. So if I can narrow the considerations so that you're more likely to be thinking about more things that disadvantage Hillary Clinton, I can increase the likelihood that you're going to cast a vote against Hillary Clinton. So those two theoretical presuppositions are grounding my analysis. Imbalances matter, and the narrowing of considerations to some things that are more likely to advantage one candidate than another can matter. Imagine in 2016 that you're more likely to think, for example, about a scandal in the Clinton Foundation than you are about healthcare reform. Pull that into the media agenda, and you're more likely to have an imbalance for Hillary Clinton in the subjects that are under consideration that you think about as you're considering whether to vote, and that can affect how you cast your vote. But I want to lay one more presupposition in place, because although I love communication scholarship, and I think communication really does matter, the literature says some things that are important about how and when. Most communication creates very little net effect. Most communication effects are fairly small. And that's largely because we have all sorts of antecedent communication and antecedent experiences that we bring to bear at any given moment. So you drop a new communication stimulus in, but there's all that other material already there. And it's not likely in most cases to make a whole lot of difference as a result. And people counter-argue against things they disagree with. They assimilate things they already agree with. That just simply reinforces, that doesn't change people's minds. So most communication doesn't have a big effect. The effects are small. Secondly, most communication effects, when they occur, are short-term. They don't last very long. So they're not very big. They don't last very long. Well, what that means is it's not very likely that Russians are going to make any difference, even if they alter the amount of content that we've got, even if they narrow the considerations, because they're not going to be close enough to the time that we vote with the stimulus to make much difference in aggregate. But that's what makes 2016 unique as a communication environment, because we had a large amount of early voting in 2016. Now, it's not large compared to what we're seeing now. We're seeing it now at historic levels, but there were about 45 million votes cast before Election Day in 2016. So in that environment, people were casting votes throughout the time in which the imbalances were being created in some places in cyberspace, in some accounts, and in mainstream as well as conservative media. That means that the communication had a capacity to matter in a different way, at a different extent than it could have had we not had the close proximity between the stimulus, the communication, imbalances, narrowed consideration, and the effect, what you're going to decide to do when you're going to vote. But there's an additional factor. In most elections, the reason political communication scholars have this little tiny niche inside the political science community is, in most elections, most people have made up their mind based on partisan considerations long before you've got any kind of election or any kind of electoral effect. So they're not even open to persuasion at that point. And with apologies, we've got a phone that's ringing that shouldn't be, so I'm going to try to get it to disconnect. And I apologize for not remembering to put that phone away. That's my daughter-in-law asking if we'd like some groceries, by the way. So I just want to tell you, I'm in COVID time and I've got a great daughter-in-law. So one of the questions that one wants to ask is, so what was the level of susceptibility of the electorate? If everybody already made up their minds, changing the message imbalances, narrowing the consideration, wasn't really going to make much difference because they were going to counter-argue against things. that they disagreed with. They were simply going to assimilate things they were going to agree with, and that was going to change what they were going to do. But 2016 was really unique. And it was unique in a way that 2020 isn't, in that you had a very high proportion historically, against the historical backdrop, of people who were still undecided when these Russian signals came to play. So if they're undecided, they're still open to persuasion. And now they're also more likely to be able to vote early. And some of these stimuli continued to be available to voters even as you approached election day. We had another factor that made it a very unique election. And again, it's not a factor at play in 2020 because a whole lot of people didn't like either of the major party candidates. And so they were undecided in large enough numbers to make a difference. They weren't terribly happy, those who were undecided, with either candidate, and they weren't highly likely to be anchored in party as a result. Those anchored in party had probably already made up their mind. But there was one additional factor. That one additional factor was a much higher proportion of the electorate was claiming it wasn't aligned with either party. And that's a factor we still see today. So was there a susceptible audience in 2016? Yes, there was. So you had a higher percent of undecided voters, as you had a higher ability to act on an immediate stimulus because of early voting. The stimulus continues up to election day, so it could affect those who voted on election day, dislike both candidates. As a result, you can mobilize or demobilize more easily under those circumstances, but you also potentially, by creating a higher level of negative information about one, can take those people who didn't really like either and have them dislike one of them even more than they did before. In other words, 2016 was the perfect storm. And there are people who are concerned that analysis like mine is saying those Russians were really smart and they're really malevolent and we have to be really frightened of them. I'm actually not making that argument. I'm not arguing they were really smart. I'm arguing they were really lucky. They had a susceptible audience in a system in which people could act on the communication stimulus with a large enough numbers available in an election that was going to be close enough that a small amount of impact could actually create a difference. And those are the theories underlying my argument in Cyberwar. With that, let me introduce Gary Gaiman, who's the wonderful person who keeps my life straight technologically. He makes PowerPoints work. He's in another location. That's good because he's going to show you the slides. So I'm going to talk about the effectiveness of Russian intervention and what we should expect in 2020. If you'll show the first slide, Gary, please. So first, it's important to remember that we still have ongoing evidence that the Russians are there. Now, there are Iranians there, there may be Chinese nationals there as well, but the Russians are still there. So I just wanted to bookmark that as an opening slide. Next. We know from 2016 that there was a lot of content. So let's look first at the amount of troll content. These are the cyber warriors marauding around pretending to be us. That's a lot of stimulus. Now, there's a common argument that's made about the trolls, which basically says, but the denominator was huge, and it was. If you say your denominator is all of the election relevant stuff that's in cyberspace, then 126 million signals is just a drop in the bucket. And we don't even know people really processed it. We just know they were exposed. So that argument has always been the first argument people raise when I offered the analysis. And my response is, you've got the denominator wrong. The denominator isn't everything in cyberspace. The denominator is how much content is reaching the individual who gets the troll content. And that's a much narrower population. So the question is, were imbalances created within accounts of susceptible individuals? Not, was there a huge body of other stuff in which they were potentially, but not actually swimming? So to make an imbalance argument, you have to focus on whether or not a lot comes into a venue in which susceptible voters are going to experience enough of it to create a message imbalance and to narrow considerations. In the first edition of the book, I said there was enough content. The question is, did it reach the right people in the proportions that would create an impact? The content was persuasive. It was largely mined from our own electoral structures in the United States. And as a result, although it did suppress the definite and indefinite article enough to cause you to pause, if you looked carefully at it to say, this probably isn't someone thinking in English writing this, the content was visually evocative. And by traditional standards, it was persuasive content if you assumed an audience that was going to be susceptible to those sorts of claims. So it was possible in this environment that there was enough, that it was persuasive enough. The question I couldn't answer in the first edition was, did it reach enough people? And when I wrote the first edition, it came out in 2018, we didn't have the full disclosure from Twitter of the entire set, and we didn't have as much disclosure as we were able to get from Facebook between the first and second edition. Second edition comes out this summer. After looking at the evidence that was gatherable between the first edition and second, I concluded that the Russian trolls did not have enough electorally relevant content that would reach enough people who are susceptible to have created the imbalances or the narrowed considerations to produce an impact. I basically took my first argument off the table, in other words, between edition 1 and edition 2. Between edition 1 and edition 2, however, the argument for the impact of the hackers on the media agenda, and hence we know people were exposed because it was inside the national media agenda, actually became stronger. So with that as a bookmark, let me quickly take you through what the trolls were able to do and what the media environment looked like that the Russians entered, because it gives us some cues about what to watch for this year and in coming years as we look at this kind of intervention. First, as some of you know, some of what the Russians say to us is very overt. And I know there are people who object to the fact that I say the Russians, as if there is this collective category called the Russians. I would like to say Putin operatives, but that just takes too long. So I'm telegraphing Russians. On my cable system in Pennsylvania, I've got RT, formerly Russia Today. As I used to travel around the country pre-COVID, it was in most of my hotel rooms. That's the Russian government outlet talking to me. And when people see RT and don't say, that's Russia Today, well, they're potentially being propagandized. You've also got Sputnik, which is also a broadcast channel. It's overt. We can watch it. It's not being hidden. The trolls, now they're covert. They're pretending to be us. That's deceptive. They're in cyberspace marauding around. The hackers are also covert, and they use Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as their means of distribution. More on that later. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the hashtag democracy RIP plan, which the Russians started to execute in 2016 because they thought Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. And which gives us kind of a roadmap we should keep in mind as we look at 2020 and beyond. So that's the outline that I'm going to be talking through, but I'm going to be focusing on trolls, hackers, and then hashtag democracy RIP. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is RT, Russia Today. It's trying to legitimize the idea that Seth Rich, who was a young Democratic National Committee staff member, tragically killed in the early morning in DC, and early morning in DC, was the person behind the hacking. It wasn't the Russians, it was Seth Rich. Why are they telling us that? Well, it's a deflective move. Next slide. You're also seeing Sputnik making moves that are trying to make the country look bad. They're trying to create forms of disinformation. I just want to flag to you that it's there because it can create some synergies in other forms, and because the trolls did promote both. Next. So let's look at the trolls. Next slide. The general discussion in public would lead you to think it was all Facebook and all Twitter. But apart from RT, which you can see publicly, the rest of those sources, they're all over those sources. Now, they reach their largest audiences through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. But as we look for where you might have malign actors, we need to look across whatever is the newest platform that is available to find audiences, as well as those that are already there. Next slide. And they had influence. So the fake sites that they set up gained more traction in some cases than the actual sites they were mimicking. The front group, which is Blacktivist, that's the Russian troll front group, attracted more sharing online, more activity online than did Black Lives Matter, the important social media group, the important social group, the social activity group, the social movement did in the United States. Now think about that. Blacktivist gets more engagement than Black Lives Matter. The same thing happened with @10_GOP. They were pretending to be Tennessee Republicans. They got more traction than the Tennessee Republicans website. So they did get into our ecosphere in ways that would suggest, relative to benchmarks in the system, that they had some success. Next. They also were clearly about magnifying cultural dislocations. They were trying to magnify fears and oppositions to cultural change. And in the process, the question is who's disadvantaged? Well, first, their advantage, Putin's advantaged if our country looks bad. And our country looks bad when it's got high levels of social discontent. But there's something else that's going on here. So as they're magnifying discontent, the question is who gets hurt by higher levels of discontent? The presumption is it's the party in power, the party that holds the White House. In that case, it would be Barack Obama, and it would be his heir apparent, Hillary Clinton. And it raises the question, as they try to roil discontent in our system now, does that hurt Donald Trump, even if in other ways they're trying to advance his candidacy by, in the language of the intelligence agencies, denigrating Joe Biden? But when people said, oh no, it was all about creating social dislocations, magnifying fears of cultural change, it wasn't really about electing Donald Trump or, more importantly, defeating Hillary Clinton. My argument is who benefits and who gets hurt by their accomplishing that first objective? And isn't it possible that they're doing both? And as a result, it's not one or the other, it's both and. I'm not going to read through the appeals. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them. Some of these are just highly problematic in ways that others are not, because they're creating fears about groups within our society and trying to vilify them and increase the likelihood that we raise negative emotions about individuals whom we ought to be respecting because they are part of who we are. Next slide. Some of these are sufficiently offensive that I'm not going to read them. I'm going to let you read them. Next slide. So what did the trolls do? The first thing that I was surprised by was that the trolls had a theory of the election that made sense. And it was the premise of the first book's argument that they could have made a difference. If your message is misaligned with the candidate you're trying to benefit, you're not going to have an effect. So for practical purposes, the presupposition of my argument that the trolls could have mattered was that their theory of the election was aligned with Trump's needs. They were mobilizing evangelicals and veterans. They were demobilizing Black voters, and they were trying to shift young liberals and Sanders supporters over to Jill Stein. That's consistent with what Trump needed them to do and Hillary Clinton didn't want anybody to do. So let's start with mobilizing evangelicals and veterans. Let me give you some signals. Some of what you're seeing with this, next slide, is just trying to find them so that they can identify the constituent elements in order to find more people like them. So some of this is straightforward political identification. If you like and share, they can then profile you, and through the lookalike function inside social media, they can identify others like you and they can begin to understand the audience. So some of this just looks whimsical and innocent. It is only whimsical and innocent if it's not being used to find an audience that's later more targeted with more sophisticated means. Why would they need to mobilize evangelicals? Why would they need to mobilize veterans? And here are efforts to mobilize veterans. Let's go through the slides. Because Donald Trump, as of August 2016, does not have the level of support among white conservative Christians or white conservative Catholics that he needs. He's not anywhere near the historic Republican average in order to carry the battleground states. The same thing with veterans. He's nowhere near where he needs in August to carry the percent that he needs to carry the battleground states. And you can think back on 2016 and understand why. So with white evangelical Christians, with white conservative Catholics, married 3 times, saying venereal disease was fighting his version of Vietnam, vulgar statements about his own daughter. What about military households and veterans? Multiple draft deferments, one for a transient bone spur, attack on a Gold Star family, saying John McCain isn't a hero. You can imagine that military households and veterans might not find those particularly appealing sentiments. And so you can explain why that part of the Republican base isn't where it needs to be to elect Donald Trump. What happens between August and Election Day is they mobilize up to the historical average that they need to be at. That is, they're at the Romney level in order to carry the number of votes that Trump needs to carry and to have a plausible shot at the Electoral College. What about demobilizing the Black vote? Hillary Clinton doesn't need the Obama level turnout among communities of color. What Hillary Clinton needs is the historic Black average across the immediate past elections, excluding the Obama calculations in there. She just needs to hit the average. But if you have a drop in the Black vote to a 20-year low, which is what we had in 2016, she doesn't have the base Democratic vote that she needs, Democratic vote she needs. Now she's in some trouble in closing out those battleground states. And so what we see is you've got some liabilities for each candidate here, and the Russians are moving in the correct direction to align with Trump's needs for both. With the demobilizing voters, what you're seeing is appeals for voter disengagement. No lives matter to Hillary Clinton. Only votes matter to Hillary Clinton. You also have in Hillary Clinton's background some areas of her biography that can be made more salient to Black voters that are legitimately part of her biographical background. Her husband's legacy of increased incarceration in the Black community, among people in the Black community. Her statement about super predators, which although literally was not referencing individuals who are Black, was instead talking about gangs, could in that context be plausibly read to have been attached to that community by those who are listening to her in the earlier context of the criminal legislation reform that was pushed by and put forward by the Clinton administration. You also see here false allegations. I'm not going to read them, I'm just telegraphing for you. Efforts to find and identify the constituents of the group through appeals to Black pride. Next. And now moves to demobilize. So explicit appeals to demobilize, including disinformation. Here's an appropriation of a voter registration get out the vote drive, which is mistakenly now being overlaid with an appeal that says you can vote by mail. You can hashtag in your vote. Same thing on the others, you can text in your vote. Of course, you can't. Appealing to the Black community, direct attempts to demobilize. The third move, the shift to Stein. You might wonder why Stein? Why not the Libertarian candidate? Why not try to shift to a party that has a larger constituency? The answer is Stein's positions on Russia are closely aligned to the ones that Putin favors. The appeal is straight out of the appeals that are being made inside the Green community. Choose peace, vote for Stein. Trust me, it's not a wasted vote. The only way to take our country back is stop voting for the corporations and banks that own us. Next slide. If you look at RT and Sputnik, what you find is they were giving Stein a lot of help. Next slide. Here's one of the ads from the Russians. Next slide. And here's Stein at the dinner. This is the 10th anniversary of RT. You've probably seen this because this picture appeared a lot in news when Michael Flynn, see him in the picture, was indicted and then convicted. And yes, that's Vladimir Putin, but look to see who's to the front of the picture. That's Jill Stein. Next slide. So what we have is the trolls are aligned in theory with the theory of the election that is consistent with Trump's needs. What about the hackers? Let me step back and say the hackers' effect is not an immediate effect. And the trolls' effect, if any, wouldn't have been either. Because if the trolls affected people, they had to affect the people before the people cast a vote in a certain way. It's an indirect effect. It's a mediated effect. The failures of the press made possible the hacking effect because the hacked content got its effect out of campaign use, yes, but also out of legitimation through mainstream and conservative news channels and opinion talk channels. And in general, reporters failed to source the content to Russians and Julian Assange, who was putting it forward through WikiLeaks. And they failed despite the fact that reporters knew that Julian Assange opposed the election of Hillary Clinton. And as a result, he should have been suspect as a source of the information that was coming through WikiLeaks. At least one should have looked at why was he dropping it when he was dropping it, and was this a selective use of the content? Secondly, the press downplayed or ignored the October 7th confirmation from the intelligence agencies that Russians were behind the hacking. Third, reporters failed to note the lack of independent verification of the hacked content. Fourth, the hacked content was not subject to traditional tests of newsworthiness. Fifth, the hacked content altered the media agenda. And sixth, at key moments, reporters took the hacked content out of context. I don't want to fault the individuals who made this decision without saying that the stresses on the system were enormous. Because remember that first slide, 150,000 pieces of content were dumped on journalists through the hacking. Newsrooms were overwhelmed. There's a wonderful piece in the Associated Press which documents the kind of stresses this put on the newsrooms. So if an election that wasn't really wanting for all sorts of other stimuli, you get this additional block of information that you have to deal with on an ongoing basis. It's coming in week by week by week. You're increasing the likelihood that mistakes are going to be made. And in fairness to reporters, failing to source to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is understandable to some extent. They should have flagged the fact that Julian Assange wanted to defeat Hillary Clinton, and that should have been more salient than it was. But many of our press organizations had partnered with WikiLeaks in the past, had been given large blocks of content that had proved to be reliable content. Now, in most of those instances, they'd had a lot of time to vet it before they put it forward, but they had no reason to just trust WikiLeaks. And so the tendency in the press to treat it as a news source as opposed to a propaganda pass-through is more understandable than not in that context. Then not failing to note independent verification of the hacked content. Again, let me make a case for why a reporter might not have. The Clinton campaign didn't seriously dispute that the hacked content was accurate. They just refused to confirm its accuracy or to deny its accuracy. And as a result, over time, reporters probably reasonably surmised that the content probably was accurate. And when Hillary Clinton addresses hacked content from one of these speeches that were released on October 7th, as if it is real, she seems to tacitly confirm at least that that is not being misrepresented. So some of the journalistic mistakes are being made in an environment in which the context helps explain them. And not applying traditional tests of newsworthiness, well, they're just being overwhelmed. And also, in fairness, they're existing in an environment now in which we have more competition from more news outlets than we've ever had before, and all sorts of things that aren't really news outlets, but are nonetheless competitors who will post uncritically and as a result give stories traction, creating pressure to at least write the story that says those stories are getting traction. But my strongest indictment of the journalist treatment is that the Russian hacked content, illegally gotten hacked content, diffused through Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, altered the media environment. Next slide. It wasn't, in other words, just conservative outlets. You've got the Washington Post up there and the New York Times. And look at the pattern across time. And this is just WikiLeaks in headlines, not WikiLeaks references inside stories. Next slide. There's the Access Hollywood tape. It comes through. It drops off the radar screen in terms of searches for information in Google. And why are you getting persistent searches across time? Because the hacked content wasn't released as a block. It was released tranche by tranche, week by week, spiking ongoing news coverage. Now, remember my theory, create imbalances, narrow the consideration. That's what's being done inside mainstream news as well as conservative news channels. Next. Journalists, after the election was over, recognized it. The overhyped coverage of the hacked emails was the media's worst mistake in 2016. This is David Leonhardt, New York Times. Next. This is Amy Chozick, also New York Times, in her book. I didn't argue that it appeared and the emails were stolen by, I didn't argue that it appeared the emails were stolen by a hostile foreign government, that it staged an attack on our electoral system. I didn't push to hold off on publishing them until we could have a less hairy discussion. I didn't raise the possibility we'd become puppets in Putin's shadowy campaign. I chose the byline. Next. This is also from the Pulitzer Prize-winning team, now New York Times. Every major publication, including the Times, published multiple stories citing the DNC and Podesta emails posted by WikiLeaks, becoming a de facto instrument of Russian intelligence. One of the reasons we are better protected now than we were in 2016 is because reporters are aware of the ways in which they were used, and in the process that they didn't apply some of their traditional standards, some of their good journalistic judgment in ways that they might have. Another reason that we're better protected is because the platforms are now looking for and interdicting troll accounts. and you have protections for against buying ads as a foreign power. They should have figured out when some ads were bought in rubles, something was going on in 2016. But now you need a US address, you need a US ID number, and there's a back and forth that involves geographic location in order to buy advertising. And YouTube now posts up the state identification under those pieces that are being posted that have state funding under them. So you know RT is Russia. You also know, by the way, that PBS has some government funding in the US. I wish they had so much that we could just say that it was whole government, but nonetheless. So these protections are now in place on the platforms, and our press is more vigilant because it's more aware of its mistakes. But the mistake I want to feature, because it factors in my argument that they made a difference, is that at key moments, reporters took hacked content out of context. Go back to October 7th. That's the day in which you've got the intelligence agencies saying the Russians are behind the hacking. Then you've got the Access Hollywood tape appearing, the article in the Washington Post, and within an hour, you've got Julian Assange posting the Podesta hacked, first tranche of Podesta hacked content. And with it, segments of speeches that Hillary Clinton's staff had flagged as being problematic. And when they flagged it, this is Hillary Clinton's staff, they put in quotation marks how sentences from speeches could be taken out of context. Julian Assange features those sentences that the staff had featured for the Clinton High Command could be taken out of context. The framing is framing that is out of context. As a result, you see that in the WikiLeaks 2 postings. The first one, you need a public and private position. The second, my dream is hemisphere, common market, open trade, open borders. This is October 7th. The first Russian hacking effect occurs when the Podesta drop occurs and the news media agenda shifts away from covering the intelligence community and confirming the Russians are behind the hacking and shifts toward the Access Hollywood tape, counterbalanced in news by a second narrative. What did the Hillary Clinton speeches say and what did they reveal? The Trump campaign at that point, the Trump High Command, and we know this from Woodward's book, were considering the possibility that Mike Pence might be moved to the top of the ticket and Condoleezza Rice moved in as the VP nominee. It was that serious. Had on that day, the Podesta hacked content not become a central part of the news agenda, counterbalancing the Access Hollywood tape, you would have had Russians are behind it, Access Hollywood tape, the news agenda would have been a negative to Trump. Instead, it became counterbalanced, negative to Clinton, negative to Trump. Trump on Access Hollywood, Clinton on hacked content in speeches. And the intelligence community and its signal were simply dropped below the fold by the next day. They are out of news by that Sunday. Next slide. In other words, I'm suggesting that they may have saved the Trump candidacy. Here's the speech context for public-private. Notice how long it is. Let's put it back in context. Next slide. She's talking about Lincoln. She's talking about the Spielberg film, about what Lincoln did in order to have public and private positions to navigate us through the Civil War. Next slide. She's saying in that context, you need to have backroom dealings of some sort. People can get some nervous, but for practical purposes, you need to have a public and private position. She was not saying to Wall Street banks, I'm really going to get rid of Dodd-Frank, but I have to say I support it in public. She wasn't taking a different position in public and private. She was commenting on the needs to be tactical and strategic under some circumstances, with her reference being that film. Let's look at what happened to that quote in the debate. Second debate, Martha Raddatz.
This question involves WikiLeaks' release of purported excerpts of Secretary Clinton's paid speeches, which she has refused to release, and one line in particular in which you, Secretary Clinton, purportedly say you need both a public and private position on certain issues. So, two from Virginia asks, is it okay for politicians to be two-faced? Is it acceptable for a politician to have a private stance on issues?
She says, I was talking about Lincoln. Trump says now she's lying about Lincoln. She tries to put it back into context. We treat the moderator as the custodian of context. We trust the moderator. And up to that point, news has also truncated the statement. So if you're an elite who pays a lot of attention to news, You've only heard it in the truncated statement section from most of your major news outlets. As a result, there's no reason to think anything other than Hillary Clinton is being disingenuous. Next slide. Here's October 9th. Remember, the hacked content becomes available the 7th. The 9th is the day of the second debate. I just showed you a clip. But here's what's being done with open trade, open borders. These are the Sunday talk shows. Sunday morning, ABC gets it right, completely in context. Hemispheric common market. Go back one, Gary. With open trade, open borders, sometime in the future, future tense, with energy that is green and sustainable as. That's one sentence. It's a dream. It's hemispheric, it's future, it's energy tied. What happens on the Sunday shows? Next slide. Here's Face the Nation. A period has appeared. Next slide. Here's CNN, ellipses, but it's still focusing. Open trade, open borders, no future tense, no tied to energy. Next slide. Fox News, Chris Wallace, ... ellipses, and then they go to a section of the speech that's 14 pages away. As of that Sunday, it's open trade and open borders. That must be what she said because we've conventionalized it. Journalists aren't going to look back and look to the context because they now think they know. Next slide. Here's the third debate.
In a speech you gave to a Brazilian bank for which you were paid $225,000, we've learned from the WikiLeaks that you said this, and I want to quote, "My dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders." So is that your dream, open borders?
Well, she says no. Here's the context. Donald Trump says, there she goes again. She's basically just being deceptive. The reason this is so devastating is that for Donald Trump, open borders is what I call a digestive statement. It's a statement that capsulizes many of his claims about Hillary Clinton. Open borders for Donald Trump means unlimited numbers of refugees, including terrorists, unlimited numbers of undocumented, he will not call them undocumented, illegal immigrants flowing into the southern border. What she has been arguing is that that is not true. Those are not her policies. She has a more circumscribed, more nuanced policy. The fact checkers have been saying when Donald Trump alleges open borders, no, that's false, here's her policy. Donald Trump tweets and then says in speeches, see, in private, that's exactly what she said. See, the fact checkers weren't telling you the truth. Why is this so damaging? Next slide. We were in the field studying debates. We've got 2 debates now in which she appears to have said one thing in public and another in private, and the moderator appears to have confirmed that. In both cases, Donald Trump has pointed out that she is being deceptive. There's no correction from the moderator that says, no, she's not. Debate 2 and debate 3, looking at debate viewers compared to non-viewers in the presence of controls for other things that would be likely to affect perception. Those people who watched the debate in the presence of controls say she's more likely to say one thing in public and say something else in private. Why does this matter? Because when you say that, it increases the predictive likelihood that you're going to say you're voting against Hillary Clinton. Did taking it out of context matter? And is it a strong journalistic indictment to say that effect is an effect produced by our journalists? Yes. Is it going to happen again? I don't think so. I think reporters confronted with hacked content are going to be excruciatingly careful. Martha Raddatz and Chris Wallace would be on my list of the 10 reporters I admire the most. If they could get done in by this, anybody could get done in by this. Our reporters are less likely to now, and I think we've got a protective effect as a result because they're aware of the problem. Next slide. So now let's talk about what they were actually trying to do. They thought Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. This is hashtag democracy RIP. It's the 4th piece of the Russian plan. First piece, the RT Sputnik public stuff, then the troll private stuff, then the hacking stuff. Well, there's another piece in there about Jim Comey and disinformation that's too complex for me to go through. But if you're interested in it, read the book. Here's the 4th piece for democracy RIP. Breaching of electoral structures and leaving footprints. Why did we find that they were there? Probably, it's at least possible that they wanted us to find that they were there, and we found that they're again there now in the current election, because knowing that somebody's been inside the system increases the likelihood that there could have been tampering, even if there wasn't tampering. It calls into question the legitimacy of the process. They may have tried to place malware in 2016. They tried to get access to they wanted to be vote watchers to come to the United States, the way the US sends vote monitors around the world. State Department said no. So if the plan was plant malware, that one was thwarted. As far as we know, there are no Russian poll watchers this time. They activated a troll campaign alleging voter irregularities and fraud at the last moment, in part through imposter news, in part through their personae that were still thought to be US nationals who had been recognized as having enough followers to be interesting, at least to some in media. And they insinuated their sleeper personae alleging irregularities into mainstream news in at least one instance on election day. Next slide. So here's your evidence that electoral infrastructure was breached in 2016, and more so than we thought in 2016. Next, here's the attempt to place malware. If that's what they were trying to do, it didn't work. Next. Here are the accounts alleging irregularities. You notice our friend at 10 GOP there. The press thought that was a Tennessee Republican account. Hold that thought. Here are sleeper individuals starting to suggest rigging, trying to magnify instances in which there have been malfunctions. And there's our friend at 10 GOP again. Next. Breaking news. There's our friend at 10 GOP. Notice whose news site that's on? NBC News. Watch election night, please, journalists that are in every local community. If you can't identify a human being with a phone number that you can identify as in the United States, that some human being is actually seen in the United States and you have talked to, and that site or that person is alleging irregularities, be wary. Next slide. And beyond, RT and Sputnik, still there. Social media activity, still there. Hacking, still there. Next. They're not just focusing on elections, they've been going after US technologies and places in which the US economy is strong, including 5G and genetic engineering. Next. They're on the local airwaves, including in Kansas. Next. Social media activities, they were in the pro and anti-vaccination dialogues in California, when California had a referendum at issue. We believe not to be pro and anti-vaccination, but to build the credibility of their personae. The people who were creating a Trump personae were anti-vax in this structure. The people who are creating the Democratic personae were pro-vax. We don't think they were trying to mess with vaccination. We think they were trying to increase their credibility. They got caught, those sites were shut down. Next. You have imposter news articles on social media sites. What are they doing? Hyping coronavirus and the Giuliani conspiracies. What's that about? That's about Ukraine. Sound familiar? That just came back recently. Whether Russians or not, uncertain. Peace data. This is imposter news. Caught, taken down. Good for the platforms. Thank you, platforms. Next. Websites promoting disinformation about the pandemic. Caught. Next. Trying to help re-elect Donald Trump, denigrate Vice President Biden. There's a statement. Next. Amplifying themes of the Trump campaign. Biden is mentally unfit. Next. We have crime and violence in our cities. Next. Mail-in voting is suspect. Next. Hacking. We now know more about their hacking from 2016. Next. And we have a warning. So let me pause for a moment. What did the US do in 2016? Barack Obama sent diplomats back home to Russia, shut down sites in the United States. Afterwards, Congress, with a veto-proof majority, passed, and President Trump signed higher levels of sanctions than the ones that were in place that President Obama had put in place. And in 2018, journalists revealed, and then later, more recently, President Trump confirmed that the US hacked back. What should we watch for? The day before and the day of the election, I expect our cyber command to hack back and shut down the operatives in St. Petersburg and elsewhere. Next. But the threat of hacking persists. Next. And interestingly, the process of stealing passwords persists in the form of a site that many of us are using to track COVID. Next. Threat persists.
We would like to alert the public that we have identified that 2 foreign actors, Iran and Russia, have taken specific actions to influence public opinion relating to our elections. First, we have confirmed that some voter registration information has been obtained by Iran and separately by Russia. This data can be used by foreign actors to attempt to communicate false information to registered voters that they hope will cause confusion, sow chaos, and undermine your confidence in American democracy. If you receive an intimidating or manipulative email in your inbox, don't be alarmed and do not spread it.
Now, the reason for focusing on this is and I have deliberately edited out the statement that this was done to benefit Donald Trump because I find it non-credible. But the reason that I've quoted this is we're always tempted to fight the last war. And what I've been doing is outlining the last war and the plans for the last war, which is democracy RIP. This is a new move. This is get email addresses tied to registered voters and engage in voter intimidation in order by pretending that you are an identifiable group that is potentially menacing, and that if you don't vote correctly in the election, you're going to be potentially harmed. So as we look forward, we need to be vigilant for all the new ways in which interference could occur, and I'm flagging this as a potential new means of interference. In summary, and Gary, if you just take the slides down, what I've argued is that we have blocked a lot. The platforms are doing a better job. Is it good enough? Journalists are more vigilant. Are they vigilant enough? We've got tests of how well our system is going to work coming into the election. We've got some hints from 2016 and some new gambits at play. We're going to know within the next, say, 4 to 6 days, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much. And we have a lot of wonderful questions. So hopefully we'll get to most of them. And I'm going to try to pick up on your thread there. This is a series of questions from Zach K. And he writes, can you share your suggested prescriptions to viral deception or this international hijacking of our elections and democracy? What do you recommend for Facebook and Twitter to do that would be different? Can the FCC play a role? And what can Congress do?
3 different questions. Platforms. We're part of a fact-checking coalition that gathers that material crowdsourced through Facebook and goes after it so that the corrective information can be put up so when people search for the misinformation, they can find our information. I would like to see that more prominently placed. I'd like to see a button that flashes to attract your attention to it. Facebook tells us that people are more likely to read the correction before they go to the misinformation, and 9 times out of 10, after they've read it, they don't go to the misinformation. So to the extent that that is a piece of their architecture, they need to do more to get everybody in that 10%, if that number is correct, to see it, and as a result, to assimilate it. The best protection against deception is reading the corrective information and having a corrective context before you're exposed. So what can they do? They can do that at the minimum. That one piece I think would be very productive. What should we do from a regulatory standpoint? Really complicated because we've got a First Amendment and it's not clear what our platforms actually are. Are they journalistic outlets? If they're journalistic outlets, I'm going to defend their right to do what it is that they want to do. Are they just a pipe? What are they? And I'm not a lawyer and I'm not going to tread into that territory, but it's a complicated question. I worry about government making rules about political speech. So I really worry when someone says, I'm not going to have access to political speech, because I go back, because I'm an elderly woman, to remembering when there once was radio as a dominant mode of communication. Now, granted, I was very, 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 very young at that point. But one of the concerns was the station owners for radio stations were deciding whose material got on and whose didn't, because they had the capacity to make the decision. And they were at that time more likely to keep the Democrats off the air because they were more likely to be Republicans. I don't want someone to get in the way of my getting access to that speech. In other words, under most situations, not all situations. So I worry about it. I worry about it in that context. So FCC, I have reservations. Congress, there's legislation that is bipartisan. It's Rubio Van Hollen, I believe, that is going nowhere, that should go somewhere. which sets up a penalty structure if foreign interference is documented, in which horrific sanctions come into play that cannot be reversed by the person who's then elected president. And the reason that's a protection is because if you manage to elect someone that way, that person would then try to shut down your sanction process to the extent that they could. I think it's a really interesting move. Also, Congress and nations of the world, there is the possibility, and now I'm not an international relations person, so again, I'm outside my area of expertise, and there may be good reasons that I'm wrong about this, but I think that there is a mutually assured destruction model that we can learn something from, in which it should be possible that at least the democratic nations in the world agree that they're going to stand down, and I think the Irans, the Chinas, and the Russias would also agree to stand down. That is, we won't meddle in your elections, you don't meddle in ours. Remember, we meddle in other people's elections too. And as a result, there's some incentive on all sides to just get everybody off the playing field. And the model in that treaty structure would be an attack on one is an attack on all. So you attack and we all throw everything we've got at you. So it wouldn't just be the US Congress, which is Rubio Van Hollen, throwing the US economic capacity behind a sanctioning structure. It would be a global community. We have some of that model right now. When the individual was poisoned in Great Britain, for example, there was a collective action across countries in response. So that's quick and telegraphic, but you're missing one point in that I want to stress. Our journalists play a really important role in this process. And we underestimate the power that the mainstream press still has to act as a gatekeeper and to create contexts of understanding and to hold people accountable by providing good corrective information. And so I don't want to close out an answer like this without saying, I think there's a really important role that is an accountability role, holding all of our institutions accountable, but also being accountable to what is reasonably knowable and ensuring that to the extent possible, the public has a grasp of that. And that's a role for the mainstream journalistic establishment. It's also a role for educators. We need to do more to increase the civic literacy of the population that comes through our school systems at all levels, and to increase its wariness of content that when sent by me to someone else, even though it came from another source, is carrying my legitimacy. People judge messages in part by evaluating sources. The minute I uncritically share, it's my credibility that's being put behind that content. We need to put that break in place so that people think before they share.
Absolutely. Audrey asks, how much can press out of context be attributed to their lack of tracing information for accuracy and following threads for longer than short news cycles? She continues, there appears to be sometimes greater emphasis on new news rather than continuing news containing further background information, to your point about accountability.
Yeah, the pace at which journalism has to act now, as opposed to, say, in the 1950s or the 1960s, is such that the simple churn is making it harder for the in-depth journalism to occur, because the same good journalist that covered the great story on day one now has to cover a completely different story by day three, day five. So that's something that appears to be inherent in a news environment that's becoming increasingly frenetic. And as a result, increasingly difficult. And we've seen a constriction of journalistic capacity. What we actually need is an expansion of journalistic capacity. And I think billionaires of the world step up and put your money behind good increased journalistic capacity, and then step back so that it's hands off and you're not influencing it. About out of context, the instances that I'm showing, and the reason I believe it's a strong indictment, is the hacked content that was released showed the context. So what is instructive about that is a journalist who went back to the primary source, which should be the journalistic rule. Don't trust somebody's coverage of the primary source, go to the primary source, would have seen the context. And what it suggests is, in the speed of the moment and the quick conventionalization of the inaccurate context, journalists forgot something, which is they were essentially engaging in secondary and tertiary citation. They weren't trusting that they'd gone back to the original. And so I think there is a protection against that kind of process in following the journalistic rule, which is, I want to go back and see what it looked like, and I want to be able to verify that that's what it was. That's the independent verification standard, not something that has been been restructured to look as if she said that. Now, I believe Hillary Clinton actually did say those things. I believe that was an actual memo from her staff. I believe that it was actually also in context because she legitimized that assumption when she answered the way that she did in the debates. But until that moment, the press had no reason to know whether the hacked content was actually legitimate there. And that's the reason for saying we haven't independently verified. Because one of the things that a malevolent actor does is gives you a lot of legitimate, accurate, you can confirm it information. And now you trust the actor because that's legitimate, accurate stuff. And now I'm going to insinuate the disinformation. And that's my Comey theory, that because the press had legitimized the hacked content as distributed by Julian Assange through WikiLeaks and assumed it was accurate, Comey, I believe, believed that if the Russian disinformation, that is, it was made up, was dropped into that same stream, it would be legitimized by our press. And half the public would be disposed to believe it anyway. But in the process, it would delegitimize the Justice Department, the FBI, and President, at that point, presumably President-elect Hillary Clinton. If that's true, what is the persuasive strategy that was being used? It's accurate, it's accurate, it's accurate. Nobody's disputing, nobody's disputing. Why should he worry when something would be dropped in this disinformation? Because you created a context in which you now are going to grant its accuracy when in fact it's not. That's what a clever propagandist does. That's why we've got to be so wary about someone saying, well, that email has been confirmed. That doesn't mean everything else on that supposed laptop, supposedly owned by Hunter Biden, supposedly gotten to, Rudolph Giuliani, supposedly gotten to the FBI. That doesn't mean anything else there has been confirmed. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that you can trust the initial confirmation until you've independently verified the confirmation. And I'm not suggesting that's Russian material. I'm not also suggesting it's not. I don't think we know.
You've answered one of the other questions without me even asking it. And another is, yesterday we had news from a reliable source that the same Russians had disrupted a number of American hospitals' computer systems. What impact do you think this type of disruption might have on our election this year?
I don't think the hospital move is about the election. Separately, we know that other nation state actors have been trying to get all vaccination information that they can get from any other place, which is kind of standard espionage. How do you steal the information about somebody else's spy plane? How do you steal information about, and how do you steal somebody else's information about their nation's best technology in the economic sphere? It's a huge issue, and one that is separable and important. I think that in the COVID area, ransomware's attacks on a hospital don't necessarily have the kind of plausible link to something else that's electorally related. It doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about them a lot. I am as worried about the fact that we have a different pattern of ransomware, that is holding hostage city governments. And we've seen across the last years that city governments have been held hostage. Basically, you're able to freeze them in place. That capacity is a capacity that we should be very worried about on election day, because our elections are so local. So when you game out the nightmare scenarios for how you interfere with the election, taking down the electrical grid is always one of them, because some of these data transfer electronically. But another is lock up the electoral structures with all these state level rules about how things count, when they count, with the Supreme Court, with the rulings that it's got. You want to create chaos, just lock up 5 or 6 key counties in battleground states with a ransomware attack. So I viewed it more as a reminder that we'd had those city government hijackings in the past to say, I've got one more thing on my list of things to worry about on election day. And that list was long already. I didn't need one more thing.
And Carol's asking, what should we be looking for in our inboxes and social media on a personal level that is likely to be the work of hackers and trolls?
I wouldn't worry about the hackers and trolls putting stuff in your social media stream. I'd worry about them taking stuff out. So I'm worried about them taking your identity. Remember that last piece I showed you? That's a very interesting move. So, why do they want the contact information for the people who are searching the Johns Hopkins site? Why do they want some of the registration data? It's not clear that the registration data they've gotten wasn't publicly accessible, by the way. that journalism is still unclear. And if some of you know with that, the answer to that with clarity, you know something that I don't at this point. So why do they want it? Well, because you can then deploy it to turn around and try to reach you through a channel that creates direct access to you. So, I mean, for a moment, just suspend your life and just say, I'm going to my computer because I'm going to vote on election day. Now, I hope many of us have already voted. I certainly have. The question in Pennsylvania is not have I voted, it's did my mail-in ballot get there on time and was it counted? And Pennsylvania tells you it got there. I know it got there. Now the next question is, are they actually going to get it counted? But imagine that you're opening up, now you're going to vote on election day and you get one of those Proud Boys emails. Now imagine it's not Proud Boy. Imagine it hasn't been discredited. Imagine we haven't said this is a foreign source. But now it came to your email address and it says, I know who you are. And by the way, they appear to know my political party. And now I'm being told how I'm supposed to vote. You know, that's the exfiltration of your data is something I am more worried about than infiltrating your social media stream. Because if you infiltrate my social media stream, you're trying to get me to like and share largely. You're trying to get to my network. And you're trying to get material that I'm disposed to believe. And then the hope is through what's called two-step flow, one of the wonderful theories developed in the 1940s and 50s by the Columbia sociologists, that I'll then use that to influence others and I'll also share online. And two-step flow has been documented both ways. We not only share online, we try to influence the people in our own social sphere. So you have some capacity there to say, well, I'm not going to do that. Who are you? I'm not going to spread that stuff around. Where somebody threatens you directly, that feels highly invasive to me and a little more than just somewhat scary. And so what else can they do? Once they've got that access to who you are, well, they're now potentially putting you in a situation in which I don't know how you were going to vote, but they say they do. Well, they actually don't if the ballots are secret. But now notice what you've got to start to go through to say, this can't be real. They can't know. My votes are private. No, I don't sign my ballot, even in states where you're sending mail in, you sign the outside of an envelope. So they can't know that about me. But are you going to go that far? Or are you just going to say, huh, and maybe you stay home?
Let's hope not. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the long-term effects of this, if the Russians had influence over the past 4 years beyond the election.
We've been following, as have many in the scholarly community, all the other kinds of things that they are trying to do. Because for practical purposes, I mean, the Russians, Vladimir Putin's operatives are advantaged if the U.S. looks bad. They're advantaged if they can undercut economic advantages that we have. They're advantaged if they can steal our technology and deploy it as their own. So all of those other things have been there. They've been a backdrop to the electoral moves of 2016. And one of the questions that I think we as U.S. citizenry should ask is, how much of that sort of stuff does the U.S. do to other places? So we know the U.S. has, I'm going to use a benign word, interfered in other countries' election. It's certainly done things that I would characterize more strongly than that under ordinary circumstances, but interfered in other people's elections. So I'm going to use the interfered language with Vladimir Putin in the United States. They do, to the extent that we're engaging in it, we don't have the moral high ground to object to it. So most of the solutions in place that involve cooperative relationships assume that we don't do it, it's being done to us. So if we start out by saying, let's make a list of all of these kinds of things, and then what are the available structures and strategies where we can all agree we're going to stand back? And in some places, the answer may be you can't. But I'm intrigued by the possibility that if you actually think you're going to get hurt, but they're going to get hurt too, you both probably have an advantage in stepping back and saying, neither one of us have to get hurt here. Couldn't we contest someplace else? But the answer is lots of places in our economy. Individual operatives trying to exfiltrate money out of our system in various ways. Anything that creates kinds of social unrest and social discontent. That's a strategy that goes back at least to the 1960s, with Russians trying to do that in the United States and then propagandizing it around the world. All there will be ongoing. The question is, can we shut the electoral part of this thing down? And by the way, let me just make one. I didn't put this argument in the slide deck for you, but we don't know that the Russians didn't alter votes in 2016. We know that we don't have evidence that they did, and that's a different argument. We weren't set up in 2016 to know whether they did in most places. We've now got a lot more places in the United States that have paper ballot backup. We've got much more vigilance looking at anything that comes into the system. We would be more likely to know in 2020 if they did than we would be to know in 2016. I've always held open the possibility that they did alter tallies of votes because we disassociate us as individuals from the vote. Once the vote starts moving through that system, the ability to tie it electronically back to me is largely a process that is difficult. And it should be. I mean, I don't want, the person who sends me the Proud Boy memo saying they're going to get me if I don't vote for Trump to know how I'm going to vote. I want the confidence to know that that's not knowable or known. But when people say, but they didn't change votes, my response is, we don't know whether they did or not. We know they were inside the structure. And we know that now we have better ways to know whether, and if so, how. Are they good enough? Don't know, but we know they're better. And we're being more vigilant about it.
And so I think this will be our last question as maybe a hypothetical. Giannis asks, is going analog a remedy to cyber threats and also a remedy to privacy and protecting privacy?
Yes, but are you willing to give up all the advantages of being digital?
If Giannis were able to talk back, maybe they would respond. But I think that concludes our Q&A for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Jamieson, and I'll bring Ken back. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much, Professor Jamieson. You've given us a lot to think about, and we certainly hope that the impact this year of all those trolls and hackers doesn't affect this election. Our next Fridays at 3 will take place Friday, December 4th, and our speaker will be Dr. Martin Blaser. He's a celebrated microbiologist. Time magazine named Dr. Blaser one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2015. Thank you again, Professor Jamieson. Thank you everyone for joining us. And that's the end of this Fridays at 3.
And my thanks as well.